Welcome to the Cosmos lecture. My name is Tobias Krüger. I'm the speaker of the IRE thesis. We are hosting the Cosmos lecture, and we're doing this in honor of Alexander von Humboldt's Kosmos-Lesungen that he did back in 1827, 1828. He gave lectures to the Berlin students as well as the general public that was interested at the time. And at that time, he was interested in a physical description of the world, a more complete physical description of the world, also related to his travels. But today we're focusing more and more on the interaction between the physical world and humans, basically in all its facets. So since 2020, we have been organizing this session here because 2019, that was Alexander von Humboldt's 250th anniversary of his birth. And since then, we have been regularly inviting scholars who deal with interdisciplinary human environment research, sustainability research, from natural science, from social science, from humanities, with a view also to discuss pathways towards transformation, towards a more sustainable future, hopefully. And in that spirit, today we have Mark Lawrence here. It's a great pleasure to introduce him. He's the scientific director of the RIFS, which is the Research Institute for Sustainability, and it's located at the Helmholtz Center for Geosciences, the GFZ. And he addresses the Anthropocene, the new geological epoch, if you so want, but I think he will discuss to what extent we can call it an epoch still. He works on the Anthropocene in an integrative manner. He has social scientists in his team, natural scientists, and people from the humanities, so a bit like our institute. And that's why it's good to team up. But he's also working very much with political actors, with civil society actors in a transdisciplinary fashion. So leaving the ivory tower of academic research to interact and develop pathways towards transformations. Today, he's talking about the Anthropocene, this term that has actually been rejected by geologists as a term for a new geological epoch. But the term still sticks, and that's interesting because it has taken hold in natural science, social science, and the humanities to describe the condition that we find ourselves in today, a condition of extraordinary human impact on the physical world, as well as human species, as well as other species. And the term is still being used to describe that condition. And I think Mark will discuss today that very condition and proposing another entry point, another term to engage with this diagnosis, which he calls the Anthropos expansion. And I look very much forward to hearing what he has in mind with this term. And then later on, we can engage in a very good discussion. What do you think about it? How we can live in this Anthropocene, in this Anthropos expansion? How can we live in it well? And how can we research it? And how can we do that together? So without further ado, I'm handing over to Mark and look forward to an interesting talk. Thank you, Mark.
Well, thank you very much, Tobias, for the invitation to be here and for that nice introduction. I'm very glad to have the opportunity to continue the good relationship we've had with the Humboldt University for many years and to participate in this lecture series. And as Tobias said, I will be telling you about the Anthropocene. You probably are a bit familiar with the term the Anthropocene. The Anthropos expansion you probably haven't heard yet before. But I'm going to spend a little bit of time setting the stage for this first. So bear with me before I get back around to the Anthropocene topic itself. And I'm going to set the stage with a topic that you're all kind of familiar with. And, well, you probably don't find it very surprising, with the topic of climate change. Now, if I were to ask who has seen this figure before, then everybody here in the room and everybody that's there online would probably raise their hand. So I'm not going to bother with that question. But I'll ask, how many of you have really looked closely at this figure before? How many of you feel like you've really studied it and looked closely? I've got one up here. Yeah, a couple. Good. When you look closely at this figure, which is quite familiar, you start to see some really interesting things. So why don't we start off with this one here, of course, the last point on the chart. We know very well that last year was the warmest year in recorded history. And we also know from the news that last year was the first year that went above the politically relevant mark of 1.5 degrees warming. If you look closely, you see the value of this is quite a bit below 1.5. It's like about 1.2 or 1.3. Why would that be? What's wrong? Or is the news reporting it wrong? Is this figure wrong? Anybody see that quickly? And you don't have to speak it out. If somebody sees it and knows it, you can just raise your hand and I'll trust you that you've found it, just so I get a feeling for it. Because I know some people find things, but they're shy about saying it in public. So I see a hand back there. Okay, so we're going to release you. If you take a look over here, WRT means with respect to 1951 to 1980. So what we often do in the climate sciences is use reference periods that are much more reliable. And the period 1951 to 1980, of course, in terms of temperature measurements, is much more reliable in terms of absolute values than the pre-industrial period, where we have a pretty good sense of what the temperatures were, but there's still a considerably greater degree of uncertainty in the pre-industrial period. And 1951 to 1980, the average temperature in that period was already something like 0.2 or 0.3 degrees warmer than the pre-industrial period. Add that to the 1.2 degrees that you see up here, and you have the 1.5 degrees. All right, next one that you see. This stands out, doesn't it? 1940s, early 1940s, right during World War II, we have this big bump in the temperature. And scientists puzzled over that for quite a while to figure out what was going on, what actually could have caused such an increase in temperature over a relatively short period. We have lots and lots of bumps in temperature over time, but I mean, this was brought it up to being as warm as the temperatures were in the 1980s. Does anybody know what that is? It turns out that that is an artifact. During World War II, the ships that were being used traditionally to measure temperature were mostly then being used for military purposes. And because of the military interventions, the thermometers that were being used for making reference temperature measurements had to be switched out to others. And so during that period, they were actually using different thermometers than in the period before and the period afterwards. And it took a long time to actually get down to that point of figuring out that the change in instrumentation over that period caused this small but relevant and significant change in what we see in temperature. But although they could tell that there was the difference in the thermometers, and they have that as the believed reason for why the temperatures change, they don't have the thermometers in the calibrated state that they were at that time, so there's no information for actually recalibrating, so they can't calibrate the temperatures back down, and that's why they just stay that way on the graph. Yet another interesting thing that you see when you look closer. If we take another look closer, we see up here, I've just cut off the end of it, and so we're going back to around 2008 or so. And if you look at what happened let's try this again. In 1998, we had an El Nino and an extremely warm year, and then a couple of cooler years after that, but then several warm years period after that. And by the time we got around to 2008, people were saying, hey, 2008, 2009 even, hey, what's this? For 10 years, we haven't had any warming. And there were big billboards up in the US, Gretchen might remember these, that showed this curve in great detail and showed a flat line across there and said, global warming is a hoax. It's all stopped. Don't worry about anything. Keep driving your SUVs, as a subline to it. So, well, if you look at how things continued on beyond that, we know kind of the picture of that. By the way, we called that a hiatus. In German, that means an Aussetzer. So, a cessation of the warming over this period. And it continued on for a while, up to about 2014, where we were still more or less in the same range of temperatures. And by 2013, 2014, Klaus Töpfer, who was at that time the executive director of the former name Institute for Advanced Sustainability, former name of our institute, and I put together a workshop where we brought together experts from around the world to both look at this phenomenon and try to understand it better, but in particular to look at how do we go about communicating between science and politics under a situation like this, where you have more and more people not wanting to believe in global warming because, or at least wanting to believe it's over, and trying to spread a narrative. And how do you work against these kinds of narratives? Well, part of the way that you do it is by actually understanding the science. And what's interesting when you look at scientific papers that were published at the time, they showed that actually in terms of what we expect, because of the energy flows between the atmosphere and the ocean and long-term oscillations in where energy is taken up in this massive system, Earth and ocean and atmosphere system, that you actually would expect, and in climate models you find, the temperature will sort of jump and then hang around at a certain temperature, and then jump and then hang around at a certain temperature, and jump and hang around at a certain temperature. And so looking back in history, if you want to, you can find periods like this where you've had sort of a jump and then around the same kind of temperature, then sort of a jump and then around the same kind of temperature. Not as severe as during the hiatus, but you do see those in the past. And in fact, if we continue on, up to the present, you see the same thing for the 8 or 9 years before the last couple of years when we've had the next jump. And it will be very interesting to see what continues on now in the years to go. And this is where part of the narrative is actually understanding the science and being able to speak authoritatively about what we see. So, but if we look over the long term, of course, looking at long term, you see a very clear trend. And interestingly, if we want to fit that line, if you continue that line out, you see it doesn't fit anymore. You have to actually bend the curve up to get it to fit. It looks like the rate of temperature increase itself may be increasing. This would not be very surprising given the exponential growth that we have of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and the exponential increase then in the forcing that we have. And of course, the big question is, where will it go from here? Now, I start off with climate change. That's not surprising. It's one of the major topics of our times. But climate change is by no means the only grand challenge that we face. We face dozens of other grand challenges. I'd just like to give 4 examples of these kinds of grand challenges that we face. One of them that is near and dear to my own past research is air pollution. And it's fascinating that air pollution often gets sort of a dirty image. It's often neglected and not really paid attention to so much, given the fact that air pollution is responsible for an enormous amount of excess mortality. Several million excess deaths per year. What does that mean? That means if you got rid of the air pollution, based on everything that we know from toxicological and epidemiological studies, you would have several million less deaths per year. What does several million mean? To put it in perspective, it's about the same number as from tobacco smoke or tobacco smoking. It's an enormous amount. This is indoor and outdoor air pollution together. We typically, however, only pay attention to this grand challenge when it really, really gets bad for some period, like the London fogs that we had, or the smog in Los Angeles, or more recently, Beijing, which was heavily in the news, and even one spring in Paris, where the air pollution got to extreme levels. And we still have this, especially in Southern Asia now, with recurrent air pollution levels that are horrendous. And those are where they get our attention. But the impacts that they have on our health here in Europe are still significant. You lose about half a year to a year of your lifespan due to air pollution, living somewhere like Berlin. Another one is plastic pollution. And plastic pollution we're all pretty aware of this as a grand challenge that we face. We see, you perhaps have personally seen beaches like this. You know about that there are parts of the oceans where the plastic mass exceeds the biomass. You know this stuff gets broken down smaller and smaller into little microplastics and nanoplastics. What you might not know about is this. How many of you have read the news recently and know why I would be showing you a plastic spoon to do with microplastics? Gretchen, a couple of you do. Gretchen, do you want to tell us?
The amount of plastic that one has in one's brain.
Bingo. Wait a minute. Take a moment and digest that, and I'll say it aloud for those who are online. A recent study has looked at the amount of microplastics in human brains. So we've got plastics and microplastics in the environment. That's already bothersome. But they looked in the human body and they found microplastics in just about every part of the human body, and it especially accumulates in your brains. And they found that the average amount of microplastics in an adult's brain in Europe and North America is 7 grams. This is actually a little bit larger spoon than 7-gram spoon. But what they also found is that in the last 10 years, the amount of microplastics in human brains has increased by 50%, robustly across age groups, gender, regions, and so on. So in a few more years, this will be the amount of microplastics on average in people's brains. By the time you all are my age, I'm sorry to tell you, but you're facing this. So it's really worrisome. Another one of our grand challenges. Yet another grand challenge is, of course, deforestation. Here we see the deforestation in the Amazon basin. We're quite familiar with the amount of deforestation that's gone on there. What we perhaps don't know about is the amount of deforestation in Europe and North America that has gone on over the last couple of centuries. It's been phenomenal. Over 2,000 gigatons of carbon, equivalent in deforestation over the last centuries. Huge amount. And we know that this is fairly closely related to biodiversity. There are distinct problems with biodiversity being related to habitat loss and pollutions and so on. But the biodiversity loss issue is, of course, a massive grand challenge for us. But it's not only habitat loss for non-human species, we also have issues of habitat loss for human species. Like with the Three Gorges Dam and the cities that were completely flooded by that, by masses of water. To give an idea of grand challenges and how much of an impact we have on the environment, masses of water that were so enormous that for a very short time, and on a very small scale, but nevertheless measurably, one could measure a change in the Earth's rotation due to those masses of water. So we have all of these immense effects on the environment. And these effects on the natural environment and these social changes that we have, like building dams, are, for the most part, only increasing in their immensity. When we look at pictures of a number of environmental indicators like pollutants in the atmosphere, carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide and methane and so on. When we look at the degree of ocean acidification or the amount of nitrogen in coastal zones or the amount of tropical forest loss and so on. You see for most of these, of course, they have been increasing over time, but you also see something interesting, which is an inflection upwards around 1950. This is quite relevant, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. We also see that in our social indicators, and in particular, we see that in population up here. And population, of course, drives a lot of the changes that we see, but not one-to-one, because the technological developments that we have also drive a lot of the increases that we see around that time. And these increases around 1950 were given the name the Great Acceleration. Along with the grand challenges that we have, the great acceleration, the vast change in the rate at which we are influencing the environment and the capacity that we have to actually see our influences on the environment on a global scale. When you look at all that and you listen to what I just told you, what comes into your mind? Maybe if I asked you, think young, think in an emoji. What would that emoji look like? Why don't we try that? Why don't you make the face of what that emoji exact? Oh boy, Vipka does this really well. So we looked for emojis that would do this, and we couldn't find any that were good enough. So we put together a handful of them that sort of give the picture. This is what you might feel at this point in time. It's really a worrisome situation that we have gotten ourselves into. And the question of, will this kind of great acceleration stop or at least stabilize, is a very open question. I'd like to take a step back and put this into a longer term context. So most of what I've been looking at is in the last 100, 150 years since the pre-industrial times. But if we go back further, 2,000 years back, we start to see, of course, something interesting that you're all quite familiar with, that we have our vast increase in temperature recently, but this very, very stable period that went back to about 10,000 BC. So I assume everybody knows what that's called, namely the Holocene. And the Holocene represents a period of stabilization where we could have then the development of extremely important developments in society, particularly agriculture, but it basically allowed us the stabilization to develop our modern society. Now, some of you will know this story. Paul Crutzen, I had the great fortune that Paul Crutzen was my thesis advisor. And he won the Nobel Prize in 1995 for his work on understanding ozone in the stratosphere, work that was done back before I was born, but it was fun to be with him as a PhD student at the time that he won the Nobel Prize and see all the excitement around that. And Paul retired in 2000. Still continue to be very active. And he had been seeing these kinds of things that I've been talking about and doing research on this throughout most of his life, and was becoming increasingly concerned with the state of humanity. And in 2000, we had an office across the hall from each other, and one day he came back, just had gotten back from a meeting in Mexico, and bounded into my office and said, "Hey, Mark, you won't believe what just happened at this meeting." And started to tell me a story of how he was sitting around at this meeting, and it was a meeting of a workshop of the International Geosphere Biosphere Project, and they were all talking about the Holocene and the changes that we're seeing during the Holocene. And he said he started really getting angry, impatient and angry. It's just that he felt wrong talking about the Holocene. And in the middle of all of it, he just blurted out to this and said, "Stop talking about the Holocene. We're not living in the Holocene. Don't you see? We're living in the Anthropocene." And everybody stopped, turned and looked at him. And that changed the whole course of the rest of the workshop and the course of the discourse around the world in a lot of our disciplines and a lot of our research. Not only in our research, though, in a lot of society with this concept of the Anthropocene. It led very quickly to a book that a German journalist, Christian Schwegel, I remember seeing around the Institute a lot, interviewing Paul and trying to get to an understanding of this and how to put this into a first text and grow this larger. Paul published it in a paper in Nature in 2002. And of course, a lot of artistic images trying to give an idea of how we can conceive what we're doing here in the Anthropocene. Paul, however, didn't invent the term the Anthropocene. He quickly looked around and saw, first off, that in the 1980s, a colleague named Eugene Sturmer had been using the term the Anthropocene, and he invited Eugene to join him in his first article in the IGBP newsletter about the Anthropocene. But it took a while to find out, and it took historians getting fascinated by this and looking into it to find out that the apparent first use of the term, the Anthropocene, goes all the way back to over 100 years ago, to Pavlov. This is not the same Pavlov as the one with the dogs in the experiments with psychology. But he was, well, actually, historians aren't positive, but it appears he was sort of a distant cousin of the Ivan Pavlov. And we see a lot of other terms that are fairly similar to that, like anthropic and anthropozoic and so on. And other concepts that were related to that, like the noosphere, the thought sphere, and so on, or the Anthropocene, which Andy Revkin in the 1990s was using, and so on. So the term actually has a long history, but Paul did a lot to revive this term and to really bring it into mainstream use. And boy, did it explode after that. Now, when we look back and we try to place this in a little bit of context, it becomes fascinating. I mean, you're familiar with the Jurassic and the Cretaceous and Triassic and so on, and on all of our more recent eras. And when we look at where we are, of course, you know, the Holocene is just this tiny little blip in this long history of the Earth here. And the Anthropocene may be an even much, much shorter blip than that. So, but the question is then, when did the Anthropocene actually start? Was it when we developed modern agriculture? Was it really basically replacing the Holocene? And we should call it the Anthropocene because that's where we've started to have these massive impacts through deforestation on the surface of the Earth? Or is it perhaps better with the Industrial Revolution, where we started to have really the impacts that we see on the atmospheric composition through emissions of carbon dioxide and other pollutants? This was Paul Crutzen's favored start for the Anthropocene. Or was it with the Great Acceleration? Because after the Great Acceleration is where we can really see the signals of the human impact on all sorts of Earth systems across the board and across the globe. Or would we call it something else? The challenge with the Great Acceleration is that it's still a little bit fuzzy and ambiguous. Many of these things can be seen in sediments, but they're not really a clear spike in sediments. And so some other discussions have been, would we call the start of the Anthropocene something that I consider extremely unfortunate from a social perspective, but very fitting from a geological perspective, with the nuclear weapons tests that were done in the 1950s, where you have radionuclide fallout that is very, very clear in the sediments. And if we go back and look at that, then we understand if we're going to define a term geologically, we need to be able to identify it in our sediments. So you'll all be sort of familiar with the stratigraphy, that you can see these wonderful layers in rocks, and you know that you can basically count the age and you can see what was going on at these times in the atmosphere and on the Earth's surface based on the composition of what is in these layers. And those are used then for classifying the beginnings of various events. So there have been other proposals, like in the 1600s, in these sediments, you can actually see a fairly clear shift, or actually more in ice cores, you can see a fairly clear shift in oxygen isotopes that was due to the mass intercontinental migrations. And those migrations brought diseases with them that particularly indigenous populations weren't prepared for. It caused them to die out in mass numbers. It caused changes in their agriculture. And that actually caused changes in the oxygen isotope signal that can be seen in these kinds of sediments. So the geologists are looking for something like that. And to look at this more closely, then you can look at what kinds of things do we see in these sediments. Well, in the recent deposits, we see all sorts of interesting things that are relevant to the Anthropocene. What we call technofossils, things like element aluminum. It doesn't start at a particular date, but it's a fairly clear signal of the beginning of element aluminum, or concrete, or plastics in the environment. We talked about plastics in us before. The plastics in the environment, of course, is also a signal. We see, of course, signals of air pollutants. In particular, things like black carbon that you can find in these. We see PCBs and other pollutants, long-lived pollutants. We see changes in the nitrate levels due to the fertilizer use. And of course, with CO2, going back to climate change, and methane, we see changes in their signals associated with the development of humans in what we'd like to call the Anthropocene. So to look at all this kind of geological evidence closely, the International Union of Geoscientists and their Committee on Stratigraphy, International Committee on Stratigraphy, put together the Anthropocene Working Group. And particularly their Committee on Quaternary Stratigraphy, the current period, was hosting the Anthropocene Working Group. And so this Anthropocene Working Group was established in 2009. But at first, they just basically were meeting online or by mail, trying to convene themselves. They had the first in-person meeting right here in Berlin, over by the Chancellor's office in the House of World Cultures, Haus der Kulturen der Welt, HKV. And at the middle of the opposite side of the table here, if I can, oops, you have to find this one here. There we go. Was the first chair, Jan Selezejevich. And I had the great pleasure of actually getting to join after this meeting was over. They had a press conference and then a follow-on discussion. And a month later, with the House of World Cultures, we hosted the first Anthropocene curriculum to actually start looking at this from a more curricular perspective. So the Anthropocene Working Group deliberated for nearly 10 years, or over 10 years, almost 10 years since this first in-person meeting, before they finally came to a conclusion. And some of you will know about this conclusion. For others, this might be a new perspective on understanding what has happened with the Anthropocene. And in 2023, they held a joint press conference where they announced what they had finally concluded would be their GSSP, the Global Boundary Stratotype Section and Point, which basically means where in the sediment layer we're identifying a signal that can be seen in all sorts of sediment layers around the world, and which particular sediment layer is most reliable and prominent for that, where we call that the point, and they drive, sometimes they literally drive a golden or a outside golden spike into that to mark the point that they consider the beginning of other epochs besides the Anthropocene. And so they announced this, and they also announced the lake sediment, or the sediment that they'd use. It was a lake in Canada, and that was a very, very still lake where the sediments are very, very regular every year, and so it gives an extremely clear signal of the last decades. And they proposed a starting date also, which was 1952. Odd date, but it has to do with radionuclide fallout and the tests of the first hydrogen bombs. But the idea was actually to have a marker that coincides with the Great Acceleration, and that really the Great Acceleration is the beginning of the Anthropocene. In the meantime, while these scientists were doing their work on the Anthropocene Working Group, first off, they brought in more than just natural scientists. Normally, these working groups of the International Committee on Stratigraphy are just geologists. This was the first highly interdisciplinary group that they had put together, bringing people from all sorts of different disciplines to look at this issue of the Anthropocene. But outside of academics, also, of course, the Anthropocene really took off. You see it here, for instance, in The Economist, welcoming us to the Anthropocene. You see even scientific analyses trying to understand to what extent is the Anthropocene an issue of stratigraphy, or is it really more an issue of pop culture? And for those of you from Germany, you'll probably know Die Ärzte, an amazing band. And the Ärzte had done a song recently called Abschied. And in that song, they bring out the Anthropocene. Come, let us go extinct, whoopee whoopee. That's all better for the world. The last pogo has been danced, the last tree has been felled. The Anthropocene has to come to an end. And I'm sure Darwin would be thrilled. Come on, let's go extinct. Maybe the dinosaurs will come back. But with this point, the Anthropocene must come to an end. I'm not sure they knew what they were anticipating. But in terms of the end of the Anthropocene, many of you know, and it was sort of hinted at in our introduction, that the Anthropocene Working Group put together a very, very solid proposal, passed it on to the Committee on Quaternary Stratigraphy, that looked at it and recommended a rejection of it, which went to the International Committee on Stratigraphy, which rejected it, which went to the International Union of Geosciences, which rejected it. So the scientists say, no, we're not in the Anthropocene, despite the fact that everybody is using it and says that we're in the Anthropocene. Their rejection is actually fascinating to read. A little bit of the text up here, and it's a good science speak that describes what reasoning they had behind rejecting this. But in the end, however, they make an interesting statement. They do recognize that the Anthropocene will continue to be used by earth and environmental scientists, even if it's not formally recognized. And of course, it will be continued to be used by the public at large in all sorts of societal sectors. So now what? Well, the Committee on Quaternary Stratigraphy and the ones above that had a suggestion. And they said, well, why don't we just get all of this out of the way? And there was a lot of politics behind the scenes in this, by the way, a lot of power politics. And of course, and I won't go into any details on it, but knowing the people that were quite involved in this, and get a lot of stories about the power politics that were played behind this. And there were some people who, for certain reasons, did not want the Anthropocene established as an epoch and would do what they could to fight against it. And one of the proposals they had to get this thing out of the way was, well, why don't we just refunction it, repurpose it? Why don't we call it maybe a geological event? And they put this up in this in a very scientific way. And I'd actually like to read this one closely because it's really relevant as the crux of this here. So an alternative narrative has therefore arisen in which the Anthropocene is not considered as a series or an epoch, so it's not in their formal classification, but rather as an event similar to other great transformative events, which we'll come back to in a moment. And none of these are represented in the chronostratigraphic units, wonderful word. None of these are formally recognized. And so there's no requirement for formal ratification. We can just call it this and go on with it and be happy, or not. But at least some would be happy with that. And then it could be taken as this informal term. So in particular to read there. As an event similar to the great transformative events in Earth history. So you probably have a few of these in mind, like the ones named here. So some of the examples of what they're talking about are the great oxygenation event, where cyanobacteria started spreading out across the globe in immense amounts, producing oxygen as a waste product. And that oxygen then escaped into the atmosphere, built up to such immense levels that it killed off a number of the cyanobacteria that were producing the oxygen as a waste product. Does that sound kind of familiar to our situation? So it didn't kill off all the cyanobacteria, but it did certainly some of them that were producing this. And it led to vast changes then in our in the biology of the world and the chemistry of the world. Another one of these quote-unquote events, geological events, is the Cambrian explosion 540 million years ago. And that's where we went from, in a relatively short time, a few million years or a few tens of millions of years, going from nearly all single-celled creatures, relatively simple creatures, to suddenly an enormous diversity of multi-celled creatures. And complex life forms, such as what we see here in the oceans at that time. And then not long after that, we had one of the next great events. The names get better and better as we go along. So we go from the Great Oxidation to the Cambrian Explosion to the Great Ordovician Biodiversification Event. Try saying that one 3 times fast. And this was where we went from the state. After the Cambrian explosion, we had a great increase in complexity, but they were still basically all living at the ocean surface, and mostly coastal. And we suddenly developed pelagic creatures, creatures that swam throughout the entire depth of the ocean. And of course, when you go from just mostly surface dwellers to the full volume of the ocean, then not only the biodiversity can increase immensely, but the biomass can increase immensely on the Earth. And so we've seen these as events. But there's a number of counter-arguments to this suggestion, calling the Anthropocene an event, a geological event. So the first counter-argument is kind of simple. Anthropocene. Let's look back and see. We have the Holocene, the Pleistocene, the Paleocene, the Miocene, the Oligocene, the Eocene, and the Paleocene. Does something sound familiar there? The Anthropocene would fit in appropriately, at least as a term, as an epoch. It's what it was meant to be, another epoch like the Holocene. So it would be kind of confusing if we suddenly have an event that has the same ending and same name form as all the terms. Another thing that we find confusing looking at this as kind of outsiders to the stratigraphic community is that there are events and there are episodes. And normally, events are relatively short-lived, like a huge volcanic eruption that causes a 2-degree cooling of the Earth for a couple of years or so. And an episode is something that goes over a longer time period. So all three of those that I showed you would actually normally be called episodes. But because this terminology came around after those were recognized, they were already called events, and they just stuck with the term event for them. But calling the Anthropocene now an event instead of an episode would also be a little bit confusing. And calling an episode would be confusing because it doesn't fit to the scene ending. And finally, if we take the Anthropocene as an episode over this long period or an event, we miss something really important, which is what I had pointed out before. This massive transition right at the Great Acceleration. So what do we do about that? Well, not long ago, I had the cool privilege of thinking about some of this, what happens now that the Anthropocene has been rejected. I mean, when that happened, I have a lecture that's called The Atmosphere in the Anthropocene. That's the name of the lecture that I teach, the Atmosphere in the Anthropocene. And after the rejection, then my colleague, who supports me with the lecture, wrote to me and said, so now do we need to change the name of the lecture? And so, teasingly, of course. But seriously, we start thinking, what does it mean? So I, and of course, many other people were putting some thought into, what do we go with this? And in the context of that, I had the cool experience of sitting in a talk at the Geosciences Research Center, which administratively and legally hosts us, and we have a number of scientific cooperations. And somebody was talking about the instruments that they used to measure changes during the Cambrian explosion, and to show evidence of the Cambrian explosion, and to show where the timing was and what kinds of uncertainty and certainties we have around that. And I got thinking, well, could we use some of those to measure the changes that we have in the Anthropocene? But then in the discussion period and asking her about that and thinking about the sort of explosion that we have now, especially since the Great Acceleration, and I said, well, can we use this to look at the Anthropocene? Or we can't call it the Anthropocene, as you all know, because it's been rejected. So maybe we call it why not the Anthropos explosion? We have the Cambrian explosion. Why not the Anthropos explosion? And that was one of those fun moments in a scientist's life, when something just plops out of you, and the director of the center and a whole bunch of other geologists turn around and sort of look and nod, and hey, this is cool, onto something. So, and I wish all of you those fun moments in your scientific lives. It's kind of neat when you get into things like that, and they just happen. You can't plan it a lot of times. You've just got to be working on it, and then you're just in an environment where it just pops up. And most of the times, sometimes the first instinct is right. Most of the times the first instinct isn't quite right, but it puts you on a useful track. Because we change this from the Anthropos explosion with the exclamation point, let you get the picture, with the exclamation point, to the Anthropos explosion with a question mark. Because after the initial euphoria over a nice term that fit to the Cambrian explosion, we realized, yeah, the Cambrian explosion fits well when you're talking about biodiversity 540 million years ago. But when you talk about explosions these days, and you associate it with the Anthropos, you have a lot of problematic associations. First off, of course, the military associations. But I mean, some people told me, yeah, it sounds like humans exploding all over the place. It doesn't work well. So, and second off, it's not really right, because we already have a term. I realized after talking, so I wrote to the two co-chairs, the former co-chair and the co-chair of the Anthropocene Working Group about this, and started talking about it. And we already have a term for the Anthropos explosion. What's that term? It's here. It's hidden now, but it's this one down here, the Great Acceleration. That's really the explosion. That's the explosive growth that we've seen. Up until then, it's been sort of a gradual growth. As you know in these pictures, I mean, we sprawl all over the place. So we tried a whole bunch of different terms. We tried the Anthropos sprawl, and the Anthropos spread, and the Anthropos growth, and so on, all sorts of different things. And we have sprawling over the place, and we have us spreading out over all parts of the globe. You're familiar, you probably don't see this very well, but this is the Earth at night, where you see the lights almost everywhere around the world. And even if you look closely, you can even see the lights on a few small island states. So you really see the spread that we have. And that's where we came to the idea. It's actually this low and long and slow, but substantial, slow on human terms, fast on geological terms, this long and slow expansion. And so we thought, maybe we'll propose the term Anthropos expansion. And I've talked over that with the chairs of the Anthropocene Working Group and with several others, and have written that up into a paper that has been now submitted. I think about the third or the fourth time. We're having a challenging time actually finding the right journal for it, because everybody says, no, this doesn't really belong to us, try a different journal and so on. But we think we might have found the right one finally. And the right format also in terms of review paper and so on. So it's a small thing, but it might be significant, because if this is taken up, if we actually have the wider geological and broader communities accepting and using the term Anthropos expansion, what do we have if it's a geological episode? First off, it allows us to really have a specific term expressing this gradual growth of the human influence on the Earth system, which has an ambiguous starting point. Sometime after the development and use of tools and so on, but when was the real impact? I mean, there's lots of different milestones that we see along the way. And these milestones, like the mastery of fire, the development of complex tools, even the development of language and abstract math and so on, that allows us to communicate and calculate what we're going to do with our personal environments and then our larger cultural and community environments and so on. So it would allow us to express this long-term development through all these milestones, including agriculture, including the Industrial Revolution, all of these steps up to what has finally led us to the present and the future state, and the present state being the Anthropocene, where we can then have the Anthropocene starting from the Great Acceleration, as was proposed by the Anthropocene Working Group. And so if this were to be taken up, it would give the Anthropocene Working Group a very good basis for being able to gather more evidence, wait until a few of those people that are politically difficult within the committee rotate off of the committee, hope that a few younger, more progressive thinking people rotate onto the committee, and put in a new proposal with the idea of the Anthropocene starting, like they had already said, from the Great Acceleration, but now with an Anthropos expansion leading up to and potentially continuing through it. So, and of course, the term is pretty easy. There have been a few other ideas around this, but with extremely scientific terms that you can hardly remember. But the Anthropos expansion, along with Anthropocene, is something that you could teach in schools. It's something that it won't get the same excitement as the Anthropocene by any means, but it's something that can be picked up easily by various sectors of society. I don't expect the Ärzte to come up with a song about the Anthropos expansion, but I do hope that it will actually be a useful term across sectors of society. So, but then, of course, this has all been looking back. And in the Kosmos lecture, Humboldt, I've talked about Humboldt in this, but Humboldt, of course, set a lot of the context for so much of what we have understood here and what we have brought into this. But of course, we don't want to just look back, we want to look forward. Think about what is next. Will this Anthropos expansion continue? And in what form will it continue? Will it continue as Homo sapiens? Will we become Homo technicus? Will we become Homo informaticus? Will something else take over what we call Anthropos? These are tough questions. Will we see stages in the Anthropocene? So if you remember back to this picture, and in the other one we saw there are ages in these epochs, and there are also phases in these epochs, early and mid and late phases, and so on. So maybe we'll see various stages of the Anthropocene, where we've had stages up until now or sometime in the future, but maybe some things will change that will actually change the Anthropocene. And they might change in directions that most of us would consider to be positive. For instance, if we actually got our energy systems and mobility systems and agricultural systems under control and got climate change under control and stabilized carbon dioxide levels. So we'd have two different phases, a growth period of climate impact and a stabilization in a quote-unquote climate neutral period. Those might be actually considered different phases of the Anthropocene. There's also other stages that could come about though. So far, the Anthropocene has been in principle an accident. We have intended to impact our local environment. We build buildings like this that changes the climate at this point drastically. We build cities that changes the climate in that region drastically. We set up agricultural regions and so on, which changes the land surface characteristics drastically. But we do all of those typically with a smaller community or a smaller setting or perhaps a city or a country in mind, but not globally. But there are thoughts to going towards global coordinated steering of our Earth systems, in particular of the climate system. And those fall under a number of names, but particularly under the name of geoengineering or climate geoengineering. And climate geoengineering is a completely different talk that I give sometimes, but it's also sort of an end of this one and a pickup to some of the other work that we do. And one of my colleagues who's one of the stars of understanding this field in the world is sitting here in the audience, and I'm very glad to see you here. And with the climate geoengineering, it's an extremely complex topic. There's all sorts of ideas that have been proposed for how we could get carbon dioxide back out of the atmosphere using biomass or using chemical means or whatever, and even ideas of how we could spray particles into the atmosphere to reflect back more sunlight, or paint buildings white all over the whole world and streets white and everything like that, or change the reflectivity of crops or so on to reflect back more sunlight, or even put mirrors up in space to reflect back more sunlight. Get into science fiction very quickly there. And there are all sorts of different responses to that too. And this is sort of now thinking about where's the Anthropocene going, coming out into the societal side and the various stakeholders that are involved. We have the scientists, many of us are highly skeptical about the potential for these kinds of interventions without causing problems that are just as large as what we're trying to prevent. But then you have policymakers who look at this and say, well, yeah, but maybe the scientists will fix that. And you have the highly techno-optimistic engineers whispering in their ear, yeah, we can fix that, it's no problem, we'll figure it out, just give us a few years. And then the policymakers thinking again about, well, you know, maybe this makes it a lot easier than changing our entire industrial systems if we have something that'll just fix this. And of course you have the Texas businessmen saying, let's make a deal. And up until about half a year ago, that was funny and got a laugh. Let's make a deal doesn't get a laugh anymore. And honestly, though, it takes on an entire different degree of seriousness when we think about how the businessmen and the politicians in some countries are now merging together to an extent that it becomes quite worrisome when we start thinking about the potentials for this. So thinking about where the Anthropocene is going, all sorts of issues around that, this being one of the many that we want to think about as we go along. So, that said, a couple of take-home messages for you. First off, I personally think that denying the Anthropocene, denying that we are in the Anthropocene, given all the evidence that we have, stratigraphically and in terms of the fact that we are influencing the Earth system across the entire planet. There's almost no part of the planet that's not being influenced by humans, whether it be through microplastic or PFAS or through carbon dioxide or through whatever. There's basically no part of the planet that's not being substantially influenced by humans, and that will not have that kind of an influence evident in thousands and thousands and thousands and even millions of years on geological timescales. To me, that's an Anthropocene. And to me, we are living in the Anthropocene. And denying that, well, it's not quite as bad as denying gravity, but it heads in that direction. But, of course, part of the issue that we have, and part of the issue that the geologists will stand behind, is that it is difficult to define a starting date for that. Now, I think the proposal, actually, at first, I personally was objected to the proposal of the Great Acceleration. I was very much in Paul Crutzen's school, no surprise, having discussed this with him since the earliest days, of saying it should be the Industrial Revolution. And I held on to that for quite a while. But especially in these discussions over the last year or so, with the Anthropocene Working Group and really coming to understand their reasoning behind it, I see that as extremely sensible. And to me, it becomes even more sensible when you propose a period before that you can characterize all of that long build-up up to the Great Acceleration. And then the Great Acceleration is where you really start to see these signals, where it really takes hold in the stratigraphic record, where it really takes hold across the globe. And that is then the Anthropocene. And to me, now, finally, that really makes sense and would support very much that Anthropocene Working Group proposal. And then finally, it's important to look back. It's important to understand the history of human influence and up until this point in time. But of course, it's extremely important for us to look forward and try to understand, where is this going? What kind of an Anthropocene will we be living in the future? And I hope for all of you and for me that it will be a glorious Anthropocene. Thank you very much. So this is when people usually start joking about climate geoengineering. They say, or when the projector doesn't work. They say, yeah, you want to geoengineer the climate, you can't even get the silly projector to work, the microphones to work, or the system to work here, and so on. And we want to do something with huge scale engineering. But now we have the small scale engineering working again. Well, and I'm glad to start a discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Mark, for a fascinating talk, engaging with the Anthropocene, with the term, with some alternative terms. Let's see if there are some questions in the audience already. Otherwise, I would have some to start us off. Yeah, over there in the back, and then Sabine.
Okay, my question is, you mentioned there were similar episode suggestions. I remember the one by the AWG, the anthropogenic modification episode, kind of as a way to moderate between the epoch and the event proposal. Mm-hmm. But I wonder if we now suggest, again, different terms to describe the same thing, it puts us back 10 years when everybody else was suggesting alternatives to the Anthropocene. And it puts away the focus from the debate on defining a geological epoch. It's not a scientific debate at this point. You mentioned the power politics, and I think a very important point in this debate is that the vote in the SQS, they violated their own voting rules in several ways. There was a Geoethics Commission report that said the vote must be stopped, but it was only released after the SQS voted. So there are clearly violations that raise the question if the science was really rejected by the geological big figures. So what is the added value of now another episode term?
So there's a few of this. The anthropogenic modification episode is one of those, what I was saying, the ones that you can hardly say. So try saying that. Anthropogenic modification episode 10 times fast. You can get it out. That was actually proposed by Colin Waters, if I'm not mistaken. And Colin Waters is currently the chair of the Anthropocene Working Group, and or Colin was the chair of the Anthropocene Working Group. But he proposed that before the vote. Interestingly, that proposal came out before this rejection vote. And it didn't get any real traction as far as I'm aware. And that's part of why, talking with Colin about it, that they're quite excited about a term that expresses the same indeed. And so you can ask the question, what's the value of it? The value of it is thinking through different terms until you get one that would get traction in the scientific community and in particular in society, one that can be picked up well and used broadly, and that would express exactly this kind of difference that was considered at the time. I would think that it gives you the opportunity to reset the debate now after the rejection with a term that would allow us then to have an unambiguous description of the period before the start of the Anthropocene and then continuing into the Anthropocene, but leading up to the Anthropocene, and then with the Anthropocene as starting with the Great Acceleration. With a term that can be used widely. I mean, like you said, it's not just a scientific issue anymore. And so the term that is proposed for the period before that is not just a stratigraphic term, like anthropogenic modification episode, but it's a term that, if it's not just a scientific issue, but it's also a societal issue, should be one that can be picked up by society. So that's the key argument that we have for the value of this. And that's part of the difficulty, honestly, of landing this in a journal somewhere, because it's not a huge new scientific point, because it has been proposed in a modified form, and we cite that in the paper. But it is new because it gives you a new value. And I mean, it's like with the Anthropocene also. There were a whole bunch of other terms that were expressing something like that, but Anthropocene just caught, and it's the right term for it. And so that's what we're proposing, and we'll see. We're hoping it might catch and help out with this debate.
Maybe before we go to Sabine, just to stay on that for a minute, because I'm also interested in this, since the Anthropocene has gotten stuck in people's heads and it's doing its work for different disciplines. What do you think the term Anthropos expansion would do differently to like a discipline like human geography, for example, or economics?
It wouldn't do something different in the sense of changing the Anthropocene. It would allow the Anthropocene to stay stuck in their heads in the same way that they're thinking of it. So basically, we have come to think of the Anthropocene as an epoch. Some people do think of the Anthropocene as the entire period of spreading out, but the Anthropocene Working Group, at least, had also in consultation with others in the community, had come up with a proposal that it should start with the Great Acceleration, with the radionuclides that are coinciding with the Great Acceleration, but basically starting with the Great Acceleration. And that's what is sort of getting stuck in people's heads, and that's the way that we've been thinking of it. And so by having a specific term, an explicit term, that scientists and societal stakeholders can take up for describing the long period leading up to that, it would allow us to just leave the Anthropocene just like it is in people's heads, instead of having to modify it. So the proposal by the IUGS and the International Committee on Stratigraphy to change the Anthropocene, refunction the Anthropocene, I find that awful, because that would really tell people, no, the way we've been thinking about it is the whole time is wrong. No, the way that you've been thinking about it is right. It is an epoch. But we need something else. And whether Anthropos expansion or whether that just contributes to the debate and somebody else comes up with something better, my key interest is seeing that the Anthropocene gets established, that the Anthropocene Working Group gets their work through. And of course, I'd be happy if the term that we come up with and propose is the one that goes through. But in the bigger picture, I think we need to get to the point that we recognize that we're in the Anthropocene. I think it's important for us in terms of our societal situation and understanding where we stand in these developments, that we collectively recognize we are in the Anthropocene, and there's meaning behind that. And that meaning that we have been developing is established and accepted and recognized.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Mark. Let's hear Sabine's another question.
Yeah, thank you, Mark, for a very nice lecture. I actually had the same question as you, Tobias, but I luckily have a second question in the back of my hand. And that is about the end of your lecture, where you sort of asked the question, where are we going, actually? And I was intrigued by the cartoon that you had, where the different actors are standing around the globe and And I was particularly thinking about the scientist, because she's standing in a corner being skeptical, saying, I feel queasy about this. And I can identify with that, right? Having thought myself a lot about the uncertainties but yet actually not being an expert in SRM as you are. So I would be interested what you think about that. Is that actually, I mean, to me, it sounds sensible to be skeptical, but is that actually a good attitude to go into it? It doesn't it also bring risks? Because, I mean, it's surfacing, it's popping up in the discussions now more and more, and it somehow feels just by stating that you're skeptical, you're not really prepared to provide a good like basis for the discussion. And it's not just like the other guys in the right hand side of the cartoon saying, I mean, the risk is not only, in my opinion, that this is used as an excuse to continue in the way that we were doing, rather than to decarbonize, to kind of directly regulate the temperature and what have you. But I think just because where we are this close to overshoot, this debate will become a lot more complex. I mean, we don't have the 1.5 degree target for nothing. People agreed that impacts beyond that would actually hurt the poorest, the worst. And I see that, I mean, there will be a lot more voices maybe putting this on the table. And yeah, just by standing in the corner and saying that we don't feel so good about it, maybe we're not prepared for this debate. What is your feeling? I mean, you're much more in this community.
Well, thank you. I'm in maybe much more in a part of the community, but I mean, we're also in the same part of, or in another community very much together, that I'll get to in a moment. So thanks so much for the question and for paying attention to that. That's really cool. This image is from a short film that was never released. We published a short film. We released a short film about climate geoengineering at the IASS back then, or RIFS was called back in the day. We released the third version. This was from the first version of it, and we had some pretty cool images like this in this that we put up because they raise exactly these kinds of questions. But when we went around and screened the first version of the film in a whole bunch of different settings, with scientists, in schools, in a couple of public settings, and so on, and had discussions around it, and we realized that first version just raised too many issues like this that weren't working. But we had the film material and kept that, and kept a couple of the images out of it because it gives us the chance to bring up exactly that. And so the final version that we brought out, we think, sort of captured the balance that we were trying to get at that time, which would be very different than the balance that you try to get on that now. And that in that balance is what you're talking about as the second part. The scientists being skeptical. I would agree entirely. It's never good to go into something skeptically. But after you've been into it for a while and you know what you know about it, then you can become skeptical. And so if we think about together what you know about it, what you established with the two things, one of them, the amount or the fraction of the scenarios that include carbon dioxide removal by some techniques that don't exist and that we don't even know could exist, and that are then the second part of it probably can't be spun up by that time. So the amount of scenarios that include some magical technique was, what did you find? It was like 95% of the IPCC scenarios included carbon dioxide removal back in the previous, yeah. So, and then the second part of it is that there's so much talk about climate neutrality, whatever that is, but let's keep it simple to carbon neutrality. There's so much talk about carbon neutrality that we want to achieve by some date, right? And you and Jan Minks and Greg Nemeth, I think, published these three massive papers at the same time as we published our review. And we independently came to the same conclusion. We would need actually decades in order to spin up the technologies to the point that they'll really be able to remove at gigaton scale from the atmosphere. And we're going to cross the 2-degree line 2040s sometime or another. By the time it comes to the average being 2 degrees, it'll be a little bit beyond that. But basically, by the time we would have these technologies spun up to the point of being able to, at least for carbon dioxide removal, for being able to contribute on a global scale, climate relevant, will already likely be past the temperature goals of the Paris Agreement. So we're very skeptical about the tones in society of, we can use these to rescue us. They may help out to ameliorate the worst of the impacts that we'll have later in this century. And that is really worth, as we both say, worth doing research on this. And the same, and so the part where we differ in our work is that I also go into the radiation management, but we find the same thing, but from that perspective, from the governance issues, from the ethical issues, and from the side effect issues, that it takes so long to understand those, they're not going to be ready until the later part of this century to actually be used if society ever decides to use them in the first place. So from all of that understanding, we become very skeptical about people saying, we can use this to rescue us. So that's where the skeptical science was meant for. But you see, it also makes you feel as a scientist, yeah, but I don't go into it skeptically. I just discover this stuff and then I become skeptical. Thanks, Sabina.
Question?
Thank you also for the very interesting lecture. And I have a question, or I'm a bit astonished that the Anthropocene is so much related to geological and chemical indicators, because I thought it's a word meaning that human beings really changing the planet in a way. And then what about the biological dimension? I mean, I thought it started maybe 2,000 or 10,000 years ago with killing all these big animals and all the deforestation. So my question is there a similar discussion in biology? When did the Anthropocene start?
Well, that's a good take. So the first part of your question I can deal with. The last part of the question, I don't actually know in the biological community well enough. Looking to Julian to see if he knows it, but whether the biological community takes a different take on the start of the Anthropocene in the geological community. In the end, the reason it becomes a geological issue, so it is both. The reason that it is also a geological issue, and that the geologists dominate partly in the formality of it, is that it's agreed in the scientific community that the geologists are the ones who name the time periods of the past, and they have fairly strict procedures, which, as was pointed out before, sometimes they don't bother to follow very closely for how they go about coming up with proposals and evaluating their proposals and making names of the past. So if it's going to be Anthropocene as an epoch, as a geological time period, then it needs to be really considered from the geological perspective. But as I had showed before, with it in the Economist and in pop culture and so on, the Anthropocene has become so much more than that. And it's not only in the Economist and pop culture, it's across the sciences. And the question of biologically, would we consider a different starting date for the Anthropocene than the geologists would? Probably. But the geologists are the ones that end up in the end with the authority on the naming of the eras, and so they need to have the way of naming it that follows theirs. On the other hand, I'm not really sure, even from the biological perspective, if we really would come up with something different than the Great Acceleration. When we consider the changes in biomass and the ratio of the amount of human-oriented and our Tierhaltung, our animal husbandry biomass to natural biomass, and how that has shifted, that we've gone from, if you know the biologists, you probably know the numbers better than I do, but I think it was something like 10% human biomass and all of our farm animals 1,000 years ago to being nearly 90% our biomass now. And a lot of that shift happened after the 1950s. The same thing with the die-off in insect biomass and so on. The 90% decrease we have has been sort of started around the middle of last century, really intensified towards the last part of last century. So I'm not sure if the biologists would come up with something different or not, but that would be interesting to consider what different communities would think about it. Beautiful question.
Yeah,
It was Gretchen.
Maybe I get to you in a minute, Gretchen, but I was also interested in maybe asking quickly, why is it important to come up with a start date? It only seems to be important from what I hear from you for geological reasons. So you can actually recognize it in some sedimentary layers. Or is there some other reason to be really precise on the start date? I could imagine one could just live with the diagnosis, okay, we are in the Anthropocene and could have started anywhere from here to there, but now let's get on with it and, deal with it. But why is it important to be so precise on the start date?
Primarily, so there's two angles to that question. Why is it important to come up with a precise starting date? That's from the geological perspective. If they want to call it an epoch, they have to have a starting date for it. So any epoch has to have a even if it's a circa, so the 12,700 years ago, or 10,700 BC, or whatever that the Holocene starts. Many of these are circa. Many of these are much fuzzier than what the Anthropocene has. Some of the criticisms of the International Committee on Stratigraphy were really unfair criticisms, because they could apply the same criticisms to all sorts of other starting dates that they have in the past. But for them, they need a starting date. But then you can flip the question around and not ask what's the importance of having a starting date, what's the importance of the starting date? And this is one of the reasons that for me, a long time, it was quite bothersome to consider the Great Acceleration as a starting date, because then Paul Crutzen and my father were born in the Holocene, and I was born in the Anthropocene. And we have that still across our society, that we have this split in the times of our society. And do we really feel that we witnessed that right in this generational split? And it's weird. I mean, a lot of people, like your expression shows that, yeah, that's a weird thing. And a lot of people were very, very disturbed by that. That got a lot of the discussion for a while in the arguments against using the Great Acceleration. But in the end, the arguments for using the Great Acceleration, if we're going to define it geologically, and if it's going to be a geologically defined epoch, are much stronger in favor of that than that one of the several arguments against it.
Okay. I think we can hear Gretchen's question.
Is it on? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I really like the term the Anthropocene. I'm kind of for it as an anthropologist, right? Like, not a geologist, and because I feel like it does precisely what you pointed out to us at the beginning, which is to say, we have climate change, but we also have this massive air pollution problem. We have massive biodiversity loss. We have deforestation. We have plastic pollution. We have also the nitrate pollution. We have there's a lot of stuff right now that's a problem. And I think the Anthropocene gets at this sense of not a single issue. It's not one thing that has to get fixed, right? It's a kind of a reorientation to the way that we live with the earth, on the earth. But then we come in the end to geoengineering, which is a solution, a set of solutions to climate change.
Proposed solutions.
Proposed solutions. Anyway, the word solution is what I wanted to point to.
Okay.
And suddenly this Anthropocene, when it returns to, when it comes to geoengineering as sort of the end of the story, is reduced then back to climate change. Because suddenly, I don't know, like air pollution, well, but if it's not too hot, fine, right? Or plastic pollution, if it's not too hot, fine. Okay, all the animals are dead, but if it's not too hot, fine, right? None of these are solvable or even really approachable via geoengineering, right? They're approachable via a sort of a much sort of more ample and much more political and much more radical set of proposals. So I just was wondering about that change, like how we got to geoengineering, which addresses one big problem, but doesn't actually address the problem that sort of makes me love the Anthropocene as a way of talking about what we're in.
So first off, I hope maybe someday I'll even get you to like the Anthropos expansion, like you like not as much as the Anthropocene. I mean, the Anthropocene, I love the term the Anthropocene as well. And part of the incentive for putting this effort into, in the midst of all the other things that we're doing, like preparing for an evaluation in 2 weeks, of still nudging forward this idea of the Anthropos expansion, is because I want to support the Anthropocene idea. That's the main idea behind it, is to enable that to continue its righteous existence. So I'm sorry if there was a misimpression that I'm considering this as a solution. Actually, it's quite interesting because I wanted to be finished at 7, and I was finished at 1 minute till 7, and I cut out another 15 minutes of the talk, and so after talking with Julian about it. And so I'm very glad that Julian suggested I cut out the other 15 minutes of the talk because it wouldn't have fit in there. Those 15 minutes were about the so-called Anthropocene 2.0, the question. And that's what actually this leads into is, and Paul and Klaus Töpfer and I proposed this a decade ago, of if we were to go down this path of climate geoengineering, and some other changes that we might see as well, but this is one potential path that we might go down in society. If we were to go down this path, it would shift us from an unintended rather, and especially an uncoordinated impact globally, Anthropocene, to an intentional, designed, and coordinated, at least part of the Anthropocene. And our question that we posed is, would that be enough that you'd call it an Anthropocene 2.0, or better, you'd probably call it an early and a middle Anthropocene, or the first age and the second age, whatever names those are given, or something like that. So that's why I bring this in here. It's not by any means to propose it as a solution to the Anthropocene, and definitely not to boil down the Anthropocene to climate change. And I appreciate your warning that if I do this without doing it skillfully enough, it might give that misimpression that I'm going right back to doing what I tell everybody not to do. And in fact, in a discussion this afternoon, that a podium discussion that we had here at Humboldt, of pointing out, there's a lot of other problems that we have besides climate change. Climate change is big, but it's, like I said at the beginning, it's one of many, and like you say, so that wasn't intended at all. And again, thanks for pointing out that we have to be very careful how we present these things, because they can come across in ways very different than the way that we're intending them. Wonderful anthropologist study.
Yeah, thanks. I have a set of questions about how the concept of the Anthropocene is received beyond the academy. You referred several times to how it's be used in society at large. So I'd be interested in knowing your opinion on how it's used by different groups in society, by policy groups, maybe civil society groups, maybe even business groups, and how far it's the usual suspects in the sense of the sort of supporters of sustainability who are using the Anthropocene term, or whether it has gained greater traction beyond that sphere and how it's used. And perhaps last little question, how far has that changed since rejection of the term by the geologists?
So of the three questions, how much has it changed since the rejection? I don't know of any studies on that. I don't know of any evidence of that, and I haven't really witnessed much of that, with the one exception that astute teachers in schools are probably shifting their use of it to fit to that, which is probably a very small fraction of the teachers of geography who are teaching the Anthropocene, if it's not in the textbooks yet, and it takes a while before it gets into the textbooks, and as you know, and so on. So I don't witness a lot of change in it, interestingly. Now remind me, second and first question, because now I addressed the third one first. Just societal groups.
How they're picking it up and how they're using it.
Yeah, so there's an interesting issue that I'd say there's a huge variety of societal groups that are using the Anthropocene. So the first part you asked was about how much traction is it picking up. Absolutely, an immense amount of traction. I mean, just a couple examples of that. You can find Anthropocene all over the place. It's not that everybody knows it, and it's mostly an educated society, but in educated society, you find it all over the place. And there's, in terms of how it's being used, I would say, to me, there's probably only one common element to that, and that's for each group to further their own agenda, not surprisingly. So for the sustainability community, using it to point out how bad things are and that we've created this Anthropocene and that we need to do something about it. Otherwise, it's just going to get worse as the Anthropocene situation that we're in. From religious communities to point out, in some cases, how far away we're going from God's world, and that this is either the world that we were given for the Calvinists, that would say, that was the Anthropocene. This is what was given to us. It's ours to take dominion over. To others who would say this is the real evidence that we're moving away from the gift that was given to us. For musicians and others, as something creative, as an interesting term to bring in. There's a song by Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds also that uses the term, and I think the handful of others that do. Artists especially like it. That because it gives them this picturing, like the picture that I have on the final slide here. There we go. That as a picturesque way of looking at it. A number of journalists have really taken up the issue and gotten into it. And again, the artists use it as a way of capturing, communicating their view of the world. The junior journalists use it as a way of communicating around things, something they've been trying to express for a long time, if they're environmental or societal change journalists. So I would say a lot of people are using the Anthropocene in the way that they want to use it, and that interestingly leads to a lot of different uses of the Anthropocene. Did I cover them? Good.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we've reached the end of our time already, right? 7:30. It feels sad to stop here, but if you're interested, maybe Mark is around for another couple of minutes. You can speak to him or to whoever's around with him privately after this. So, but this one we need to draw to a close. And my last thing to announce is quickly that the next Cosmos lecture is on 23rd of October. We have Corinne Pelluchon visiting. She's a philosopher. We don't know the title of the presentation yet, but it will be interesting. So please come again and advertise it widely to your colleagues and friends. And for today, I'm thanking Mark Lawrence again for a very interesting talk, for a very good discussion here with everyone. So thanks, Mark.
Thank you.